want to talk about cluster analysis. So myself, I first happened, if you could show the screen, please. I happened on cluster analysis for the first time in the course of my PhD, when colleagues of mine were looking at simulations that were, so molecular dynamic simulations that were many million time steps long, and they wanted to understand the behavior of small peptides or proteins. And one question they had was, which are the stable structures in the simulation? And thermodynamically, this is related to the free energy. So if you have low minima in the free energy, this will correspond to highly populated states. And one task was to try and find the highly populated states in the simulation. So that was one example where cluster analysis was used to find the representative members in a data set. Another aim of cluster analysis is for compression, for lossy compression, to perform lossy compression. And another motivation is to find natural groupings in data. Now there's a host of methods for cluster analysis, and we can distinguish them according to different criteria. So different criteria to distinguish methods are, for example, fuzzy versus crisp. So crisp means each observation belongs to a single cluster only. And fuzzy is the opposite, so one observation can belong to several clusters. Or another distinction is hierarchical versus non-hierarchical. In hierarchical clustering algorithms, we have a nested structure in our data. So we have some kind of ordering parameter, and such hierarchical clusterings are often represented in terms of a dendrogram. Where we have scale, and then a tree which need not be but often is binary. And so on. So let's say at this layer, these are our original observations, and here we would, for example, see that there is one outlier which only merges into our single final cluster at very big scales. Then for a pretty large range, there is just this outlier versus all of the rest. Then there seem to be two subgroups within the rest, and so on. And how stable a particular clustering is often measured by the number of changes that occur as you move along the scale axis. But now, if you pick a particular scale, then you get fixed clustering. Here, for instance, we would get 3 clusters at this level. So depending on where you cut, you get out different clusterings out of such a dendrogram. Now there is a host of papers on what are good measures, what are good criteria. I will present just a single one as an example of how to obtain such a hierarchical crisp clustering. It is called single linkage clustering. And it is crisp and affords a hierarchical structure. The algorithm is simple. You repeat a merge operation, merge clusters Ci and Cj, which has those two clusters which have the smallest distance between any of their two elements. So xk is a member of Ci, just a minute, and xl is a member of Cj. Sorry. Repeat. We repeat. Sorry. So we merge the two clusters Ci and Cj, which have the smallest distance between any of their two members. And we keep doing that either until this distance exceeds a fixed threshold, then it is really called the single linkage algorithm, or until a single cluster remains. Sorry, my writing seems to be terrible today. What can you not read? It's okay. Now, there are a couple of arbitrary choices. One of the choices is in your distance metric. So what d do we use? And then that we use the smallest distance between any two members is also arbitrary. We could use we could have used a max in here, or we could have used an average in here, and indeed that gives rise to other algorithms. Now, this particular algorithm, it's not such a very good algorithm, because can you imagine what goes wrong with this algorithm here? So let's say I have something which looks like two groups of data to us. So we can build a dendrogram, and if we now cut the dendrogram at a level where we have just two branches left, do you think that we would recover this structure of these two groups of points or not? Why? Uh-huh. Yeah. So we have a bridge here between these two cluster centers, and if the sampling along the bridge is sufficiently high, then it will not break at that point. And indeed, this algorithm, it tends to produce long, elongated clusters. Which is sometimes the behavior you want in your data set and sometimes not. And by the way, this generates a subgraph if we stop early here with a fixed threshold, the minimum spanning tree. And hence you can use any of the efficient algorithms to build minimum spanning trees, to give you the minimum spanning tree which you can then threshold at a given level. Okay, and in this dissimilarity measure here, all of your domain knowledge should enter. If you cannot imagine anything better, you can use Euclidean distance here, but then you have to be aware or make sure that the scaling of your different features is comparable. So it will matter if you measure one of your features in kilometers or in meters, because it will scale the number by a factor of 1,000, and this will, distort the isocontours that you find in this dissimilarity measure. And then instead of the min, as I said, you could take, for example, the average distance as a criterion, or you could take the maximum distance, and that will give different clustering algorithms with different artifacts and different sets of problems. Okay. Now, since there's a lot of heuristics in this field, I want to leave it at that, and I want to talk about an algorithm which seems to be more universally important, namely k-means clustering. Who has heard about it before? Okay. Shall we skip it? No. By the way, it's also called the Linde-Buzow-Gray algorithm or the Lloyd algorithm, after their inventors who worked in communication. And I have already briefly mentioned k-means clustering when we talked about bilinear decompositions, about PCA and SVD and such. And in fact, it optimizes the following criterion. We have an error. It's given by that, where X is our original data matrix. So this is our P by N matrix, where we have N feature or N objects, each characterized by P features. And C is a P by K matrix, and M is K by N. So X holds all data. C is the set of cluster centers, or our code book, and M are the memberships. Now, if I wrote just that, it would be a recipe, or it would be optimally solved by the singular value decomposition. But here, I want to impose additional constraints, namely that I want all memberships to be non-negative, and I want the memberships for each point to sum up to 1. So this is a vector here, and this is also a vector filled with all ones. Okay, and k-means clustering looks for cluster centers and memberships that will minimize this error function here. Yes? Exactly. Yes. For fuzzy clusterings, it's a fractional membership, or the responsibility which different cluster centers have for an observation. And here, actually this will turn out to be crisp here, but I don't need to impose it. This simply comes out of the energy function for the following reason. If I have so the Frobenius norm, it's a quadratic norm, and if I have a cluster center 1 here and a cluster center 2 there, and this is supposed to be a parabola, and if I now have some point here which I would like to assign to the cluster centers, if I assign it to C2, I have to pay this much. If I assign it to C1, I have to pay that much. And if my aim is to minimize my overall cost, I gain no advantage in mixing. It's best to simply assign it to the single cluster center that is closest. It's only right here at the border between two clusters, at this position here, that I have some freedom. Okay, so this is the criterion, and this function here, by the way, if I fix M, then it's convex in C. If I fix C, it's convex in M, but unfortunately it's not convex in both C and M. And the k-means algorithm is now one particular algorithm that tries to minimize this in an iterative fashion, namely by alternately fixing C, finding the best M, and vice versa. So this is a heuristic, iterative optimization scheme. Which finds, unfortunately, only local minima of this energy function. And it alternates these two steps, which I already call E step and M step in analogy to expectation maximization. In the E step, it assigns all observations to the closest cluster center. So this means find M given C. And in the M step, given these new memberships, it updates the cluster centers to minimize the energy. update the cluster centers to the center of mass of their observations, which means find C given the M's. So as you see, this is extremely simple. It's a few lines of code. And I mentioned that it only finds local minima. So indeed it is sensitive, depending on how you initialize. It's sensitive to outliers. Can you explain why, or what happens if I have a few points far away? Yeah, so let's say I have two clusters that I'm interested in, and I have a single outlier, and if I now start k-means with k equals 2, I would like to get one cluster center here and one cluster center there, but what I may find effectively is to get one center here and the other one there located on my outlier. Exactly. Okay, so let me show a demo of this. So in this case, 3 cluster centers were used, and the observations have already been assigned to their closest cluster center. And I can now estimate updated positions for my cluster centers. I don't expect huge movements now, so maybe this one will move down a little bit. So because the way they happen to be initialized now, which was randomly, they are already pretty much in the center of their observations. Okay, and now I can re-estimate the assignments of points to cluster centers, which has happened here, and this we can now iterate until convergence. And the algorithm can be proven to converge. So it does converge. And by the way, I found a nice script by Matthias Seeger. Let me look up the name. It is so his course is called Pattern Classification and Machine Learning, and this script is the one that comes closest to this lecture of everything that I've seen. I've seen the script only last weekend. But for example, the proof of k-means converging to a local minimum is in this script, which I think is roughly at the level of detail that this course has. So I like it. It's very well written, I think. Yes, we can. Typically, the initial positions are taken at randomly selected observations. So you could also initialize them randomly somewhere in the hypercube but if you do that, then it may happen that some of the cluster centers have no members at all, and you run into numerical problems and so on. So most typical thing is to initialize them at some of the observations. The number k is the only obvious parameter here, besides, of course, the scaling of your feature space or of your features. The number of steps required or the final solution? No. The final solution very much depends on the initialization. You find just a local minimum. Okay, it's a nice greedy algorithm, but greedy. Okay, now this algorithm is extremely well studied in communication, where it is related to vector quantization. And I want to briefly comment on this relation. So again, this comes from communications, and let's say we want to transmit a phone call across a line, and we have some amplitude here, and if I now do not want to, let's say, use a double accuracy number, or if I do not even want to use a float number for each individual time point, I can try and somehow approximate this data. And the simplest approximation would be to simply partition the amplitude into equispaced bins, like we did for the histogram, and then transmit the index of the bin number. So this would just be rounding. The advantages of rounding are that I need to specify only how wide my bins are and where the first bin starts. And after that, I can simply transmit the index of a bin that each sample falls into. Now, we typically have some statistics. So let's say if you take an entire phone call, you will get a distribution that is not uniform between some minimum and maximum value that defines your dynamic range. But you typically have some probability distribution here. Let's say in a proper dialogue, person A is not speaking all of the time, so person A is also sometimes quiet. So maybe we have a peak here, meaning that we get we have lots of zeros, and you don't shout at each other at the top of your voice all of the time. So typically you have a low probability for very large amplitudes. And if you now use these equispaced bins, that would not seem perfect, because there are some indices which you would hardly ever use, and then other indices that you would use very often. So a better scheme here would be to make your bins narrower, where you have lots of data, and make them wider where you have fewer observations. If your goal is to minimize the mean squared error of your reconstructed signal for a given bandwidth. So if we have this one-dimensional signal, this would be called scalar quantization. So So this is a lossy compression scheme, but one that has smaller loss than just rounding. Well, and now vector quantization is just the generalization of scalar quantization to multidimensional feature spaces. So vector quantization, or VQ for short, is the generalization of scalar quantization to multiple dimensions. And well, in vector quantization, you transmit your code book. So that's the set of all cluster centers once at the beginning of your transmission, and after that you simply transmit the indices of code vectors that a particular sample is assigned to. And this is also an extremely important representation in image analysis. I've shown similar pictures already when I talked about object category recognition a while ago. So when we talked about SVMs, I said that linear SVMs are used for object recognition. Here I show you one of the earlier uses of such histograms. So here this is from a 2001 paper where the task was to classify textures. And let's say you have an image with 1,000,000 pixels. That's a lot of numbers. And you now want to find a more compact representation for this image. One possibility is to extract some kind of statistic. So let's say you pass your image through a filter bank, or you just take patches of the image. So anyway, you want to take multiple numbers that characterize local context in your image, and you can then vector quantize the resulting feature vector. And once you have found your code book, you can, for a set of patches, assign them to the cluster centers and thus represent your entire image in terms of just a histogram. And these histograms will have hundreds, or here it's dozens, but for more complicated tasks, these histograms will have hundreds or thousands of bins, and that is a huge compression as compared to the millions of pixels that you have in the original images. So the use in image analysis is in bag of words representations of images. Where the aim is to find a low-dimensional representation for the image at hand. Yes, one cluster center corresponds to one bin. And by the way, there is another school of Well, compression. So the point here is that for this, to optimize your code book, you need a sample. So vector quantization is data adaptive. You need, let's say, for phone calls, representative examples of people speaking in order to find a good code book. And in contrast, other people use data independent bases such as, and then that's a huge area of research, so such as wavelets, for example, or different transforms, like the cosine transform. So in image compression, if you use a JPEG image, it could use vector quantization, but it doesn't. So there you use a fixed set of basis functions, cosine functions, and then you use the discrete cosine transform to express your image in a lossy fashion. Having said that, even in JPEG, there's a quantization step after you compute the discrete cosine transform. All right. So, do you have questions for the k-means algorithm? Yes. How about the metric used? So the k-means method really uses the Euclidean distance. So I wrote the Frobenius norm squared, which if you sum it across one of the columns here, will give you your Euclidean, your squared Euclidean norm between your original observation, which was one column of x, and your approximation, which is one row of C. No, it's all rows of C multiplied with one column of M. And if you used other metrics, then these steps would no longer be optimal. So this assigning the cluster centers to the center of mass, the center of mass is derived from or as the point that minimizes the mean Euclidean distance given membership assignments. So as it is, this algorithm only allows you to play with your features themselves, but it insists on your using the Euclidean distance. And so don't switch yet, please, because I have to look around. Yeah, I'm showing you a variant here. So this is from a website called datacompression.com. And this is a hierarchical version of k-means, which simply shows how you can train in an iterative fashion by splitting. So you run this until convergence, and then you split each cluster center in the direction of maximum spread, and then you keep iterating and so on. Now the method as shown here is not hierarchical, but you can also produce a hierarchical method by saying that the children of a cluster center are only allowed to repartition among themselves the observations that were assigned to their parent. and that is a pretty good way of well, finding or of devising a method that allows you to quickly identify the cluster center that belongs to an observation, because you don't have, if you get a new query, you don't have to search over all of your k cluster centers, and k could be a large number, but you can arrange these results in a tree and then proceed to a leaf quickly. More comments? Okay, so that much for k-means clustering. We'll have a break, and then I'll talk about a fuzzy alternative to this.